USA Basketball didn't just make a mistake with Caitlin Clark. They exposed a system that was never designed to survive her. And the craziest part? They still haven't admitted it. For months, fans were told the story was over, that the Olympic roster was set, that the controversy had passed. That Caitlin Clark's name would eventually fade from the conversation once the season moved on and the machine kept rolling. But that didn't happen. Instead, something far more dangerous unfolded behind the scenes, something USA Basketball never expected and definitely never wanted. Because while the public was arguing on social media, something else was happening quietly. Executives were panicking. Sponsors were asking uncomfortable questions. Coaches were being forced to defend decisions that suddenly looked indefensible. And a power structure that had existed for decades started cracking under pressure from one player who never said a word. She just kept winning. This isn't a story about hurt feelings or a single roster decision. This is about how Caitlin Clark's presence exposed how outdated the entire selection process had become. It's about how an organization that prided itself on control suddenly lost it. And it's about a rule change, or at least a philosophical shift, that insiders insist was never supposed to be public. Because once you understand what actually happened after the snub, everything changes. The silence, the sudden backtracking, the quiet talk about evolution, none of it was random. And the people who stood in her way, they may already be losing their grip. But to understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back to the beginning, to the decision that everyone assumed would blow over. When USA Basketball left Caitlin Clark off the Olympic roster, they believed they were making a safe decision. Not a bold one, not a controversial one. Safe. Behind closed doors, the logic was simple. Experience over hype. Veterans over rookies. Stability over disruption. It was the same philosophy that had guided selections for years, and in their minds, there was no reason to change it now. Caitlin Clark was talented, sure, but they believed time was on their side. They believed she'd get her turn later. And more importantly, they believed the noise would die down. That's the part nobody wants to admit. The assumption wasn't just that Caitlin Clark would understand. It was that the fans would move on, that the outrage would peak for a few days, maybe a week, and then dissolve into the background like every other sports controversy before it. But this one didn't behave like the others. Instead of fading, the reaction intensified. Every game Caitlin played turned into a statement. Every sold-out arena became a reminder. Every spike in ratings quietly contradicted the narrative that this was all just hype. USA Basketball had expected a cooling-off period. What they got was acceleration. Because while the organization stuck to its messaging, this isn't about one player. We value experience. The roster reflects team needs. The market told a completely different story. Caitlin Clark wasn't just relevant. She was unavoidable. Viewership numbers didn't dip. They climbed. Merchandise didn't slow down. It vanished off shelves. Road games didn't feel neutral. They felt like home crowds following her across the country. And the more the institution tried to hold its line, the more disconnected it appeared from the reality unfolding right in front of them. This wasn't just fan enthusiasm anymore. This was cultural momentum. And momentum doesn't ask permission. What made the situation worse was how clean the contrast became. On one side, you had an organization preaching patience and hierarchy. On the other, you had a player redefining what star power looked like in real time. Not with theatrics. Not with statements. Just with performance. Every time Caitlin Clark stepped on the floor, the question resurfaced. Not loudly. Not angrily. But persistently. Why isn't she there? USA Basketball never found an answer that stuck. Because the more they tried to justify the decision, the more outdated the justification sounded. Experience became a shield instead of a strategy. System fit began to feel like code for resistance to change. And the worst part, the snub didn't just fail to protect the institution. It put a spotlight on it. Suddenly, the organization wasn't the authority anymore. It was the defendant. Fans weren't just upset, they were curious. Media coverage shifted from reporting to questioning. Analysts stopped parroting press releases and started asking whether the selection process itself made sense in a modern game driven by pace, spacing, and visibility. What USA Basketball thought would be a minor controversy became a referendum on its relevance. And still they waited. They waited for the season to settle. They waited for Caitlin Clark to cool off. They waited for the narrative to change. It never did, because the snub didn't humble her. It sharpened her. And that's when everything started to unravel. Not because of a tweet or a headline, but because of what happened next on the court. But that moment didn't just challenge the decision. It destroyed the argument. USA Basketball didn't feel real pressure until the argument collapsed in public. For weeks after the snub, decision-makers could still hide behind theory. They could talk about systems. They could talk about chemistry. They could talk about international experience and defensive schemes. As long as those conversations stayed abstract, the institution was safe. But then Caitlin Clark played the game that turned theory into evidence. This wasn't just another strong performance. It wasn't a hot shooting night or a flashy stat line that could be dismissed as noise. This was a direct challenge to the philosophy that kept her out. And the timing couldn't have been worse for the people who made that call. Because the opponent wasn't random. The defensive looks she faced were familiar. Structured. Disciplined. Designed to slow the game down and force patience. The kind of system that USA Basketball has trusted for years. The kind of system that values control over creativity. And Caitlin dismantled it. Not by forcing shots. Not by playing hero ball. But by doing the one thing the system wasn't built to survive. She sped it up without losing efficiency. She stretched the floor until help defense became a liability. She made rotations arrive a half-second late, and at this level, that's fatal. What made the performance so uncomfortable wasn't just how dominant it was. It was how calm it looked. There was no chaos. No panic. Just precision. And that's when the narrative snapped. Because the old argument said she wouldn't translate. That her game was too loose. Too flashy. Too dependent on freedom. But in that game, freedom didn't look reckless. It looked inevitable. Every adjustment failed. Every counter exposed another weakness. The defense wasn't just beaten, it was rendered obsolete. And people noticed. Not just fans. Not just commentators looking for a talking point. The people who noticed most were the ones who had staked their credibility on keeping her out. Because now, the question wasn't hypothetical anymore. It wasn't could she fit. It was how did you miss this? The broadcast didn't say it out loud, but the tone changed. You could hear it in the pauses. In the way analysts stopped explaining and started reacting. The confidence behind the snub narrative evaporated in real time. And behind the scenes, that's when phones started lighting up. Executives watching realized something uncomfortable. The performance didn't just make the roster decision look questionable. It made it look personal. Like ideology had taken priority over results. And once that perception takes hold, it's almost impossible to reverse. Because sports institutions survive on the illusion of objectivity. The moment fans believe decisions are driven by stubbornness instead of strategy, trust erodes fast. That game did more than win over skeptics. It embarrassed the framework itself. It showed that the system wasn't neutral. It was selective. And worse, it was fragile. Insiders would later describe the reaction as disbelief. Not anger. Not outrage. Disbelief. The kind that sets in when a narrative you've rehearsed for months collapses in under 40 minutes. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. The expectation was that Caitlin Clark would need time. That she'd have growing pains. That the transition would slow her down just enough for the decision to look reasonable in hindsight. Instead, she accelerated. And acceleration is dangerous because it compresses timelines. It forces decisions early. It eliminates the comfort of waiting things out. By the final buzzer, one thing was clear to everyone watching. The argument that kept her out no longer existed. And when arguments disappear, institutions don't adapt publicly. They adapt quietly. Because once that game ended, the conversation shifted away from, was she ready? To something far more dangerous. What do we do now? And that question led directly to a series of meetings nobody planned to admit were happening. But they were. And what was said in those rooms would change everything. Publicly, nothing changed. USA Basketball didn't release a statement. There was no sudden reversal, no admission, no acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. On the surface, it looked like business as usual. The roster was set. The conversation, at least officially, was over. But behind closed doors, the tone couldn't have been more different. Because once that game ended, the silence wasn't confidence, it was containment. Emergency conversations began almost immediately. Not in press conferences or interviews, but in private calls and closed meetings. The kind of conversations that only happen when people realize a situation has slipped out of their control. This wasn't about fan reaction anymore. They had weathered backlash before. This was about credibility. Decision-makers started asking questions they hadn't prepared for. Not about Caitlin Clark's talent. That debate was over, but about how the organization would explain itself if the trend continued. If the ratings kept climbing. If every performance kept reinforcing the same conclusion. The worst part wasn't that they might have been wrong. It was that they might have been exposed. Inside those rooms, the language shifted fast. Words like process and philosophy quietly disappeared. They were replaced with terms like optics, impact, and long-term positioning. That alone told the story. Because when institutions stop talking about principles and start talking about perception, they know they're in trouble. What made the situation even more tense was the realization that this wasn't just a basketball issue. It was a branding problem, a trust problem, a future-facing problem that couldn't be solved by waiting it out. Executives began mapping scenarios they never expected to consider. What happens if the outrage doesn't fade? What happens if Clark's presence keeps redefining the sport faster than the institution can respond? What happens if the public starts seeing Team USA as out of touch? Those questions don't have easy answers, and none of them can be solved by pretending nothing happened. The meetings weren't about reversing the decision, not yet. That would have been too obvious, too humiliating. Instead, the focus was on mitigation, on reframing, on making sure this never happened again. And that's when the word change entered the conversation. Not publicly, quietly. Change didn't mean apology. It didn't mean accountability. It meant restructuring without admitting why. It meant adjusting the selection philosophy just enough to prevent another situation like this, while insisting the adjustment had nothing to do with Caitlin Clark. But everyone in the room knew that wasn't true, because no one was talking about abstract future players. Every example led back to the same name. Every risk scenario centered around the same problem. They had underestimated her reach. What complicated things further was timing. This wasn't happening in an off-cycle lull. It was happening in a moment where women's basketball was gaining unprecedented visibility. Every misstep felt louder. Every contradiction traveled faster. The organization realized something else too. The longer they waited, the weaker their position became. If they pivoted too late, it would look reactive. If they pivoted too early, it would look like panic. There was no clean exit. So they did what large institutions always do when cornered. They started preparing the ground quietly. Internal reviews, conversations about data-driven selection, subtle language about modernization. Nothing concrete, nothing quotable, just enough to signal flexibility to the people who mattered most. Because while fans were still arguing online, another group had begun paying attention. And this group didn't argue. They invested. And when they started asking questions, the pressure multiplied. USA Basketball could manage fan outrage. They could tolerate media criticism. They could even survive analysts questioning their judgment. What they couldn't ignore was silence from the people who fund the spotlight. Because while the public debate raged on social media, a quieter and far more consequential conversation was unfolding behind the scenes. One that didn't involve opinions or emotions. It involved exposure, return, and risk. Sponsors had noticed. Not because they were scrolling comment sections, but because the numbers stopped making sense. Engagement was exploding around Caitlin Clark, and yet the biggest global stage in women's basketball was moving forward without her. That contradiction didn't sit well. For brands that had tied their identity to visibility, momentum, and cultural relevance, this wasn't a philosophical issue. It was a logistical one. You don't build a campaign around the future of the sport and then leave that future at home. The questions started subtly. They always do. How are selections being evaluated? What guarantees exist for global exposure? How does this decision align with long-term growth strategies? On the surface, these were routine inquiries, but the timing made them anything but routine, because these questions weren't being asked in isolation. They were stacking on top of one another, creating pressure that no press release could relieve. What made it worse was the context. This wasn't a random Olympic cycle. This was a build-up to something much bigger, a home soil Olympics on the horizon. A once-in-a-generation opportunity to showcase the sport at its peak. And Caitlin Clark was already the face of that peak. Sponsors understood something the institution was slow to accept. Star power in modern sports isn't just about performance. It's about narrative gravity. It's about who pulls attention without effort. Clark didn't need marketing. She generated it. Every game she played created content. Every moment traveled beyond basketball circles. She wasn't just attracting existing fans. She was creating new ones. Younger ones. Global ones. The kind of audience brands chase relentlessly. Leaving her off the biggest stage wasn't just a miss. It was a liability. And once that realization set in, patience evaporated. The pressure didn't come in the form of threats. It didn't need to. It came in tone shifts. In pauses. In meetings that ended without reassurance. In follow-ups that didn't feel satisfied. When sponsors start asking for clarity instead of updates, it means confidence has cracked. And inside USA Basketball, they felt it. Because the institution could defend its philosophy all day. But philosophy doesn't pay broadcast partners. It doesn't justify underperforming reach. And it doesn't explain why the most marketable player in the sport was watching from home. What began as a roster controversy was now a business problem. And business problems demand solutions. That's when the internal messaging changed again. Conversations stopped being about whether Caitlin Clark belonged. That was no longer in question. They became about how to ensure this scenario never happened again, without publicly admitting that this one was a mistake. This is where the idea of process evolution gained traction. Not a rule change. Not officially. Just a refinement. A modernization. A forward-looking adjustment designed to reflect the changing landscape of the game. Safe language. Flexible language. Language that could be explained without saying her name. But everyone knew what triggered it. Because institutions don't overhaul selection philosophies unless something breaks the system. And Caitlin Clark didn't just expose a crack. She forced a stress test the system failed. By the time the sponsor conversations intensified, the decision-makers understood one thing clearly. They couldn't afford another Caitlin Clark situation. Not financially. Not culturally. Not politically. And that realization would soon spill into a far bigger shift. One that threatened the power structure itself. No one inside USA Basketball ever called it a rule change. That word was too dangerous, too traceable, too easy to connect back to one moment, one decision, one name. Instead, they used softer language. Strategic language. The kind that sounds proactive rather than reactive. They called it a review, an evaluation, a modernization of the selection process. On paper, it sounded harmless. Necessary even. The game is changing. The landscape is evolving. Data is becoming more important. Impact is harder to measure with old metrics. All reasonable explanations. But timing is everything. This review didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't emerge after years of internal debate or a slow philosophical shift. It appeared suddenly, right after the Caitlin Clark controversy refused to die. That's not coincidence. That's cause and effect. What made this shift so significant wasn't the details, but the direction. For decades, USA Basketball selection leaned heavily on intangibles that favored incumbency. Experience, familiarity, comfort within the system. These weren't written rules, but they were powerful ones. And they worked, as long as the system controlled the narrative. But Caitlin Clark didn't just challenge the roster. She challenged the logic behind it. Her impact couldn't be brushed aside as theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and impossible to contain. So the conversation turned toward data. Not stats in the box score sense. Those had always existed, but broader indicators. Audience engagement, viewership spikes, attendance patterns, market response. The things institutions pretend not to see until they can't ignore them anymore. This was new territory. Because once you start factoring in real-time impact, the hierarchy collapses fast. Seniority loses weight. Legacy stops carrying as much influence. The door opens for players who don't fit the old mold. And that door leads directly to Caitlin Clark. The irony is that this shift had been inevitable for years. The sport had been trending towards speed, spacing, and star-driven growth long before this moment. But institutions move slowly, until something forces them to sprint. This was the sprint. The revised thinking wasn't about making room for one player. It was about preventing another embarrassment. About ensuring that the next generational star couldn't be sidelined by tradition alone. Internally, there was resistance. There always is. Change threatens comfort. It threatens control. And most of all, it threatens the people who benefited most from the old system. But the alternative was worse. Sticking to the same approach meant risking irrelevance. It meant watching the sport evolve around them while they defended decisions no one believed in anymore. So the shift happened quietly. No press release. No announcement. Just subtle signals. New language in internal documents. Different criteria in conversations. A growing emphasis on current influence instead of historical contribution. That phrase alone said everything. Because current influence is impossible to discuss without acknowledging Caitlin Clark. She had redefined what influence looked like in women's basketball. Not by demanding it, by earning it. And yet, even as the process shifted, the institution refused to say why. They wouldn't say her name. They wouldn't admit the snub forced their hand. They framed it as growth, as evolution, as a natural response to a changing game. But evolution doesn't happen overnight unless survival is at stake. And this wasn't just about staying competitive on the court. It was about staying relevant off it. About proving to fans, sponsors, and future players that USA Basketball could still lead, not follow. What they didn't fully grasp yet was the collateral damage. Because once you start dismantling an old system, you don't get to choose which parts fall first. And the next shift wouldn't just affect players. It would threaten the people who built their power within that system. The most dangerous part of change isn't the rules themselves. It's who those rules stop protecting. For years, the power structure inside women's basketball was stable, predictable. Veterans set the tone. Coaches controlled the narrative. Systems were treated as sacred, and questioning them was quietly discouraged. That structure didn't just shape rosters. It shaped careers. If you understood how to navigate it, you were safe. If you challenged it, you were labeled difficult, selfish, or not ready. And for a long time, that dynamic worked because there was no force strong enough to disrupt it. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. What made her different wasn't just talent. Plenty of talented players had come before her. What made her dangerous to the old guard was scale. Her impact didn't stop at the hardwood. It spilled into arenas, broadcasts, and conversations that the traditional power brokers didn't control. And younger players noticed immediately. They were watching how the most visible player in the sport was treated. Watching how excellence was still negotiable if it didn't fit the preferred narrative. Watching how loyalty to the system mattered more than redefining it. That sent a message, and not the one the institution intended. Because if Caitlin Clark could be sidelined despite doing everything right, what did that say about everyone else coming up behind her? Players like Angel Reese, Cameron Brink, a new generation with massive followings and no interest in waiting quietly. They weren't just watching games. They were watching politics. And they were learning. The old guard had always relied on patience as a control mechanism. Your time will come was the unspoken rule. Fall in line. Fit the system. Don't rock the boat. But patience loses power when players realize leverage exists. Caitlin Clark never demanded anything. She never complained publicly. She never attacked the institution. And yet, her influence grew so large that the institution had to respond anyway. That's when the balance shifted. Veteran authority began to feel less absolute. Locker room dynamics subtly changed. Conversations that once would have stayed internal started happening out loud. Not in confrontational ways, but in questioning ones. Why are decisions made this way? Who actually benefits? What does experience really mean? Those are dangerous questions in a hierarchy built on tradition. And the institution felt it. Because once players stop seeing the system as neutral, loyalty erodes. And when loyalty erodes, control follows. The generational divide wasn't about age. It was about mindset. The new era values visibility, pace, and connection. The old guard valued discipline, structure, and predictability. Neither is inherently wrong. But they can't coexist without friction. And Caitlin Clark stood right at the center of that friction. Not because she wanted to, but because her style exposed the fault line. What made this moment so volatile was that the shift wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening in real time. Every sold-out arena reinforced it. Every viral clip widened the gap. The institution could ignore a loud critic. It couldn't ignore a silent revolution. And revolutions don't ask for permission. They force choices. The next choice would put one of the most established figures in women's basketball in an impossible position, because the philosophy she represented was suddenly under threat. And once that happened, the conversation stopped being about players altogether. It became about power. Every era has a face. Not always the most famous one. Not always the loudest. But the person whose ideas quietly shape how decisions are made, how success is defined, and who belongs inside the circle of trust. For years, Cheryl Reeve represented that face. She wasn't just a coach. She was a philosophy, a belief system rooted in control, discipline, and collective structure. Her approach valued reliability over flash, predictability over experimentation. It worked for a long time. Championships validated it. Stability protected it. And institutions love what feels proven. But what happens when the game moves faster than the philosophy? That question became impossible to ignore once Caitlin Clark's rise collided with everything Reeves' system stood for. Because Clark didn't just play differently. She challenged the assumptions that the system relied on. Reeve had been clear about her stance. She didn't care about hype. She didn't care about narratives driven by attention. She cared about fit, about execution, about players conforming to the system rather than bending it around them. That mindset was once seen as principled. Now it looked rigid. The problem wasn't that the philosophy failed overnight. It was that it stopped scaling. In a sport evolving towards speed, spacing, and star gravity, a system that resists adaptation becomes vulnerable. Caitlin Clark exposed that vulnerability without ever naming it. When her style shredded structured defenses, it wasn't just a tactical loss. It was an ideological one. It suggested that control had limits, that creativity could be efficient, that freedom didn't equal chaos. And that's dangerous for any philosophy built on minimizing variance. What made this situation so uncomfortable was that Reeve didn't need to say anything publicly. Her past statements, her selections, her emphasis on system loyalty, all of it was already on record. So when the internal conversation shifted toward building around impact instead of fitting into tradition, the implication was unavoidable. The philosophy was the problem, not the player. And that realization places someone like Reeve in an impossible position. Because adapting would mean admitting the old approach no longer dominates. And resisting would mean standing in the way of the sport's most powerful momentum. Institutions rarely say this out loud, but symbolism matters. Keeping a figurehead whose ideas feel outdated sends a message. Not just to players, but to fans, sponsors, and future stars. It says change is conditional. And right now, conditional change isn't enough. There's a reason conversations about transition started circulating quietly. Not firings, not demotions, just strategic evolution. Language designed to soften the reality that a regime shift might already be underway. Because once an institution starts planning around a player like Caitlin Clark, everything else becomes negotiable. System, adjusted. Philosophy, updated. Leadership, reevaluated. That doesn't mean Cheryl Reeve is irrelevant. It means the environment she thrived in is disappearing. And environments don't disappear gently. They fade as new ones take over. The most telling sign wasn't criticism. It was silence, the lack of public defense, the absence of reassurance. When institutions stop shielding their symbols, it usually means they're preparing to move on. Whether that move happens quietly or publicly remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. If USA basketball is serious about embracing the future, it can't be anchored to the past. And that brings us to the scenario they fear the most, the one no one wants to say out loud, but everyone is planning around. There is one thought that terrifies USA basketball more than backlash, more than criticism, more than being wrong. It's the thought they never planned for. What if Caitlin Clark doesn't need them? For decades, representing Team USA was treated as the ultimate destination. The honor was automatic. The prestige unquestioned. Players didn't negotiate, they accepted. The institution held all the leverage. But leverage only works when the other side depends on it. And Caitlin Clark quietly flipped that equation. As the internal conversations intensified, a scenario started circulating in hushed tones. Not as a threat, not as a demand, just as a possibility. And sometimes possibility is more dangerous than certainty. What if, come 2028, Caitlin Clark chooses not to play? Not out of protest, not out of bitterness, just choice. That idea alone sent shockwaves through the organization. Because the 2028 Olympics aren't just another cycle. They're in Los Angeles. Home soil. Prime time. Maximum exposure. A moment designed to showcase the sport to the world like never before. And Caitlin Clark is the engine of that visibility. Imagine the optics. A home Olympics without the most recognizable player in women's basketball. No sold-out buzz. No casual fans tuning in just to watch her. No crossover appeal pulling new audiences into the sport. It would be catastrophic. Not competitively, Team USA would still be strong. But culturally, commercially, it would be a disaster. And the worst part is that Clark wouldn't even have to say no publicly. She could frame it as rest, as preparation, as focusing on her own path. Perfectly reasonable, completely unassailable. That's what makes it terrifying. USA Basketball realized something too late. The honor of selection only matters if it's still the highest platform available. And Caitlin Clark has already proven she can command attention without it. Her games outdraw international competitions. Her presence sells arenas. Her influence doesn't depend on an Olympic logo. For the first time, the institution needed the player more than the player needed the institution. That's the power flip. And once that reality sets in, panic follows. Because institutions are built to control outcomes. They don't respond well to uncertainty, especially when that uncertainty revolves around a single individual holding all the leverage. This is why the shift feels rushed, why the language softened, why the tone changed from authoritative to accommodating. They aren't trying to recruit Caitlin Clark. They're trying to prevent rejection. Every internal adjustment, every quiet conversation about future alignment, every hint of modernization is rooted in that fear. The fear of being exposed as optional. And once an institution becomes optional, its authority evaporates. That's why this moment matters more than any single roster decision. It's not about Paris. It's about Los Angeles. About legacy. About whether Team USA remains the center of women's basketball, or just another stage Clark can choose to step onto or not. The irony is brutal. By trying to assert control, they lost it. And now, they're scrambling to rebuild a relationship they assumed would always be one-sided. But fear alone doesn't guarantee sincerity. Which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. Is this change real? Or is it just damage control dressed up as evolution? USA Basketball wants this moment to feel intentional. They want it framed as growth, as foresight, as a natural response to a sport that's evolving faster than ever before. They want the narrative to suggest that this shift was always coming, that Caitlin Clark just happened to arrive at the right time. But the timing tells a different story. Because real evolution doesn't look this rushed. It doesn't emerge under pressure. And it definitely doesn't arrive wrapped in silence and half-explanations. What we're witnessing doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like containment. Every institution hates admitting mistakes, especially ones made in full public view. It's far easier to rename the error than confront it. To call it adaptation instead of reversal. To say the game has changed rather than admit they failed to keep up. And that's exactly what this feels like. If USA Basketball truly believed in this new direction, the messaging would be clearer, louder, more unified. Instead, it's cautious, vague, carefully worded to avoid acknowledging the spark that lit the fire. They won't say Caitlin Clark forced the issue. They won't say the snub was a miscalculation. They won't say the system failed. But the behavior says all of that anyway. Because you don't quietly reevaluate your entire selection philosophy unless something went wrong. You don't start prioritizing current impact unless the old metrics failed to explain reality. And you don't suddenly care about optics unless optics have already hurt you. This isn't proactive leadership. It's reactive survival. And that distinction matters. Fans can sense the difference. Players definitely can. They know when change is genuine and when it's a temporary concession designed to calm things down. The danger for USA Basketball isn't backlash anymore. It's credibility erosion. If players believe this shift is just damage control, trust won't return. They'll comply, sure, but compliance isn't belief. And belief is what sustains institutions long-term. There's also the question of accountability. No one has taken responsibility. No one has explained how the process failed. No one has said what safeguards are in place to prevent this from happening again. Without that transparency, skepticism grows. And skepticism breeds distance. The most uncomfortable truth is that Caitlin Clark didn't ask for any of this. She didn't demand change. She didn't pressure anyone publicly. She just performed at a level that made denial impossible. That's not collaboration. That's surrender. The institution didn't evolve because it wanted to. It evolved because the alternative was irrelevance. And that creates a fragile foundation. Because if this shift is built on fear rather than conviction, it can collapse just as quickly once the pressure eases. Which raises the final question, not for USA Basketball, but for Caitlin Clark herself. Does she accept this quiet olive branch? Or does she force the institution to prove that this change is real? Because for the first time, the decision isn't theirs. It's hers. This is the moment every institution fears and every star waits for, the moment when leverage fully changes hands. For the first time, Caitlin Clark isn't reacting to USA Basketball. USA Basketball is reacting to her. That distinction matters more than any apology, any quiet process change, or any internal review. Because power isn't about what's offered. It's about who gets to decide. And right now, Caitlin Clark has options. She could accept the shift quietly. Step into the new framework. Let the institution save face while benefiting from the adjustment it never wanted to admit was about her. That would be the smooth path, the diplomatic path. Or she could do something far more consequential. She could make them commit. Because if this change is real, it should survive sunlight. It should withstand clarity. It should be strong enough to be stated plainly, without spin or softened language. Clark doesn't need a public apology. She doesn't need validation. She already has the numbers, the audience, and the influence. What she has now is leverage, moral, competitive, and financial. If she chooses to step into the Team USA future, it should be on terms that guarantee this never happens again. Not to her. Not to the next generational player. Not to the sport she's already reshaping. Because what happened in 2024 wasn't a tragedy. It was a catalyst. The snub didn't stop Caitlin Clark. It clarified her position. It revealed the limits of institutional control in a modern sports landscape driven by connection, visibility, and undeniable impact. She didn't need to fight the system. She outgrew it. USA Basketball now stands at a crossroads. It can either embrace this reality fully or continue dressing panic up as progress. But one thing is no longer negotiable. The future of women's basketball will not wait for permission. Caitlin Clark has already changed the NCAA. She's already changed the WNBA. And whether the institution admits it or not, she has already changed Team USA. The only question left is how honest they're willing to be about it. Because history won't remember who made the rules. It will remember who forced them to change. This story is still unfolding. Roster decisions, coaching futures, internal power shifts. None of this is settled yet. And the closer we get to 2028, the louder these quiet moves are going to become. So if you want to stay ahead of the headlines, if you want the real story before it gets cleaned up and sanitized, make sure you're subscribed. Turn on notifications, because this situation is moving fast. And when the next move happens, we'll break it down the moment it drops. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did USA Basketball really change? Or did Caitlin Clark force their hand? Either way, this throne shift is happening in real time.